Hi friends. Within the last couple of weeks, I have finished a triathlon. And if you know anything about triathlons, it's a swim, followed by a bike, followed by a run. There's lots of different distances. I certainly didn't do the long distance one, but I did a triathlon. And with 4 young kids and other things going on, I didn't exactly train as much as I had thought, and I got my tail kicked in many ways on the course. In fact, while I was out there, I was being passed by men, women, old, young, teenagers, adults. But I had already decided when I went out there, I wasn't racing against them. So I wasn't going to measure myself against them. I was racing against me. Knowing the constraints I had on time and effort and energy, I was out there to challenge myself. The reason that's important is over the last decade plus, investors have gotten jumbled and confused in a sense as to what they should be comparing their investment performance to. From March of 2009 all the way through December of 2021, the S&P 500 averaged almost 39% annual returns. The 100-year average is just over 10%. So what we had was a roughly 12-year period that we just got out of where the average annual return was almost 4 times the long-term historical average. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, one of which we would argue is that from 2000 through 2012, the S&P 500 had a 0% return. It's what historians famously call the lost decade, even though it was a little longer than a decade. But my point is simply this. Investors have gotten used to comparing their returns, their portfolios against the S&P 500. Consider this video an official disownment of the S&P 500 as a valuable benchmark for the average investor. And let me tell you why. There are 503 holdings in the S&P 500. The reason is there's a couple of companies that have different share classes of stock, but there's 503 companies in the S&P 500. 5 of those companies, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Apple, make up almost 22% of the 503 companies. So think about that. 5 companies represent roughly 22%, and the other 498 represent 78%. Those 5 companies have produced 94% of the S&P 500's positive return this year so far at the making of this video. You may look at that and say, well, why don't we just invest in those 5 companies then? Well, not so fast. Last year, those 5 companies, on average, were down 41.5%. Think about what that means. The stock market as a whole was down about 20 last year. Those 5 companies were down on average 41.5%. So if you had $1 million invested equally between those 5 companies, you lost $415,000 last year. The point should be clear by now. The S&P 500, because of its disproportional weighting through this last 10 to 12 year growth run, has disproportionately weighted to certain companies, and it is no longer an appropriate measuring stick for most investors. It's no longer an appropriate performance benchmark, and it no longer actually captures what's going on in the broader economy. There are roughly 6,000 publicly traded companies in America between the different exchanges. The S&P 500 is less than 10% of that, and what we just found out is that there's really 5 companies. So we're talking about less than 1% of publicly traded companies representing how an investor should perform. It's nonsense. There are lots of different benchmarks that might make sense. One benchmark that we think makes a lot of sense for a lot of investors is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index. That has nearly 4,000 holdings in it. So instead of representing less than 1% or less than 10%, the S&P 500, of the overall publicly traded companies, this represents nearly 2/3 of it. So what we see is the actual indication of what's going on in the economy. How are different sectors and different sized companies across different type investments performing? Something like the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index is a far, far better gauge of what's going on in the economy and where the equity markets are. But remember, unless you're willing to take on the full weight and risk of the equity markets, then really something like the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index might not be the index for you. My point is simply this: the S&P 500, in our opinion, is no longer a valid or valuable tool for most investors to measure their performance, their risk, and their portfolio. So stop measuring your performance, your risk, and your portfolio by something that no longer provides the picture that you need as an investor. So in individual conversations, we can help flesh out for you what's the right index to measure for your portfolio performance. But for me, for most investors, it simply is no longer the S&P 500. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.